Hello there, friends. It's Jimmy Maverick. Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Maverick podcast. And today we are going to talk about the least consistent players in the top 100 of the fantasy draft, players that you need to avoid in this upcoming season. So here we go.
Listen up. It's time for the Fantasy Maverick podcast, starring the guy who's going to help you win that fantasy championship, Jimmy Maverick.
Hello there, friends. It's Jimmy Maverick, and welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Maverick podcast, coming at you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And today we're going to talk about consistency, and we're specifically going to talk about the least consistent players that are currently sitting in the top 100. So let's just start out by saying, what is consistency? And for me, consistency is how involved that player is in the offensive game plan, regardless of how the game is going. Okay. So it's a measure of inputs. It's how many targets, how many touches do they get each game, and how much does that vary from game to game? So, when you're looking at fantasy, the worst kind of players for me are the guys that'll get you 12 targets one week and 2 targets the next, right? Those guys will murder your fantasy team, and you'll have no idea when to start them. And if you're like me, what you end up doing is you start them on the week they get 2 targets. So you bench them and they get 14 targets and have a huge game. So you start them again and they get like 4 targets, right? That's always how it goes for me. So I hate these kind of players for season-long fantasy. So what I did is for my app, My Perfect Fantasy Draft, is I created a consistency rating. And what it is it measures the variance in their usage on a week-to-week basis during the prior season. And, it takes out any weeks that they don't play, that they're inactive. Basically, based on that variance, they get assigned a score. And then if they're in the top 10% for that player category, be it a running backs or wide receivers or tight ends, if they're in the top 10%, with their score, they get 10 out of 10. That's the best you can get in my app. And it goes down from there. So if you're in the bottom 10%, you end up getting a 1. That's the worst consistency rating you can get on my app. So that's kind of how it works. My app also goes ahead and it takes away their highest volume game and their lowest volume game before calculating this number. Because as far as I'm concerned, any player in the league can have a terrible game, and any player in the league can have what I call a gonzo game, where they just go off. Everything's going their way. So I want to take those 2 away and then look at how they did on all the rest of the games. So basically we're looking at, for most players, 14 games, their middle 14 games during the course of the season. So one of the big takeaways I want to give you is that volume creates consistency, okay? When you look at, say, receivers that play on run-first, low-volume passing teams, what you tend to notice is their consistency ratings are pretty bad compared to other receivers. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from players from low passing volume teams. A.J. Brown scored a 4 out of 10. Tyler Lockett scored a 2 out of 10. DK Metcalf, 4 out of 10. Deebo Samuel scored a 3. Hollywood Brown scored a 3. That's a big part of this, right? So when I'm looking at players to draft, what I want is from the low volume passing teams, I like the running backs and the tight ends. From the high volume passing teams, I like the wide receivers. And that's kind of how I, generally strategize with these players. But that's a good rule to follow when you're in your fantasy draft. So let's look at, we're going to look at each of the positions. We're going to look at running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And we're going to point out some low consistency players. And do you need to be concerned for the upcoming season? So we're going to start out with one who, anybody who took him knows how terrible he was, David Johnson, who is now in Houston. So he's got a fresh start there. But he ends up having one of the worst consistency ratings of any running back in the league last season. He rated a 1 out of 10. All right, it's as bad as you can get. It's as low as you can get. And it's not hard to see why. Like in the first 6 weeks, he was basically averaging about 20 touches and targets a week. And then he got injured. He missed a few weeks. But then when he came back, he had been replaced by Kenyon Drake, and he was only getting somewhere between 3 to 6 opportunities a game. It was nothing. And so on the high end, you got 20, and on the low end, you've got 3, 4, 5 touches. And that's how he ends up with this terrible, terrible rating. Now, I do anticipate that it will be better this year, right? Volume creates consistency. David Johnson is heading into a high volume situation. Carlos Hyde got 245 touches last year, okay? And Carlos Hyde doesn't catch balls either. David Johnson does. Now, there is also an issue here that Duke Johnson is still on this team. Duke Johnson had 61 targets last year. Right now, I'm projecting him to get about that same amount of volume, but because Hopkins isn't on the team anymore, there's going to be some shuffling among targets to other players, and I feel that David Johnson is a safe bet to also get somewhere around 50 to 60 targets this year, which makes him really great. I mean, I'm looking at the high 200s for volume. I think he's going to be fine as far as consistency goes. I think with him, another issue is just health, right? Can he sustain a full season anymore? He is 29 this year. But his ADP is at number 44. So he's a 4th round pick. As a 4th round pick, I love him. But just a little warning for anybody that's picking early, right? Anyone that has top 5 picks in your draft, you're probably, if you want him, you would have to take him in the 3rd round. I do not like him as a 3rd round option. There's lots of better running backs in the 3rd round that you should take before David Johnson. But if he falls to your 4th pick, I absolutely like him this year. I do trust him. His consistency will be much better. So that's the first one. Now the next one is it's a team situation, and these guys need to be brought up because they had poor consistency during the course of the season. And I'm talking about the Niners, and specifically Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman. So last year also Matt Breida was on this team, and it's kind of interesting because all 3 of these running backs all scored a 4 out of 10 on consistency last year. And it was, if you look at the numbers, you can see, oh, this is the week Matt Breida had a good week. Oh, here's the week that Tevin Coleman had a good week. Oh, here's where Mostert did good. And right now, Mostert is going at ADP 59. And he's the first one coming off the board. Of course, Breida is no longer on the team too, so that does help as well. But Mostert closed out the season very, very strong. He did very well. And so that's why he's going as early as he is in the draft, especially compared to Tevin Coleman, who's going at 114. But really, when you look at Kyle Shanahan and the way he runs his offenses, he does not utilize a workhorse. He doesn't. He goes with the hot hand. Raheem was hot at the end of last season. He was great. But this consistency is a concern of mine. That are you going to be able to trust Mostert on a week-to-week basis, given that he is splitting time with Tevin Coleman? So, it is a run-first offense as well. There's good things and bad things here, but just because the consistency rating is such a question mark here, and generally very poor, just from the way that Shanahan runs his offense, I'm not sure if I could trust him here. You've also got issues about the Super Bowl slump. They play in the toughest division in the NFL. It's going to be a tough year. It's going to be a tough year for San Francisco. And I'm thinking that they might not even make the playoffs this year. That's how concerned I am about this offense, because I really not sure if they're the first or second best team in this division. I think they're probably the 3rd best. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But that is something to be concerned about. You don't want players like this on your team. Mostert seems like a great choice for daily fantasy because he can go off, and he had some monster games last year. But do you really want to bet on him on a week-to-week basis? ADP 59, you can get him at a good spot, So you got to weigh this against each other, but it's just a level of concern for me with the low consistency on running backs on this team. So let's move on to wide receivers. Now, there are two elite options that stand out, and not in a good way, man. They are both going at about the same point in the draft, and both these players had the notoriety of scoring 0 points on a game that they were active in and they were getting targeted in. 0, which is crazy. But one of them is pretty obvious. The second one is not. But the first one is Amari Cooper, who's going at ADP number 25. And he has kind of been the poster boy for inconsistent play during the course of his career. And last year was no different. Did you know that he had 3 separate games where he only received 2 targets? And then he also had 2 games where he received 14 targets. So that's the kind of player that will drive you insane during your fantasy season. And it's not like there's any further clarity here. I mean, at least in San Francisco, one of the running backs is gone, but in Dallas, they have added an elite wide receiver option in CeeDee Lamb to this team. So will Amari be able to grow his target share in this offense? I don't think he can. Is he still going to have these boom bust games? And I think, yes, I think, that is what's going to happen here. And so I just cannot recommend him for your fantasy team because you know what's going to happen. But, again, Amari Cooper, great for daily fantasy, great option. So take him for that, but don't take him for your season-long fantasy team. Don't put yourself through that, especially as he would be your wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, something like that. And then at least this other guy, Mike Evans, ADP number 23, also scored terrible on his consistency last year. 2 out of 10 is what he scored, amongst the worst of running backs, especially for an elite level running back. Evans, he has gotten over 1,000 receiving yards every year he's been in the league, which is an impressive feat. But he has consistently had a terrible reception percentage. He usually only is able to catch around 55 to 60% of passes thrown his way. Now, of course, we're talking Jameis Winston passes, but still, it's been a consistent issue for him that he has not been able to get like a 70% reception percentage, which most elite wide receiver 1s can do. Now, he makes up for it in his yards per catch, and he is a deep ball guy, man. You chuck it deep, and he catches it in the end zone probably, or on his way to the end zone. So that kind of hides these issues, these consistency and this reception percentage issues. And you got to think about, man, he's getting a quarterback change. It's 43-year-old Tom Brady. And I know a lot of people are talking about Mike Evans as being, is going to explode this year with Brady. And yes, Brady's a better quarterback than Jameis Winston, for sure, no question. But Brady's at the point of his career where he's not going to chuck it deep. He's not going to be able to do that like he did in the past. So that's an added risk here. So again, I think tremendous bust potential for Mike Evans. And I see a continuation of this inconsistent play because he will have a couple of games where he's going to get that 80-yard touchdown catch, and he's going to have an amazing stat line, for fantasy purposes. But I can see him also being in a game where he only gets 3 or 4 catches for 30 yards, and he's just going to kill you for fantasy because, you took him in the second round, and this is what he's doing for you. So stay away from Mike Evans too. There's just too many negatives here for me to even think that it could be possibly improve in the upcoming season. So let's see here. So let's finally talk about tight ends. I got a couple I want to talk about. And the thing with tight ends, man, how I say that volume creates consistency. Well, tight ends are a problem because tight ends are all low volume. Outside of a couple of elite players like Travis Kelce and George Kittle and Zach Ertz, right? Those are like the 3 high volume tight ends. But everyone else So many tight ends fall into the 50 catches, 500 yards, 5 touchdowns, which is essentially irrelevant for fantasy football. The only way they're worth anything is if they get a touchdown. That's the only reason they would be worth anything on any given week. So consistency becomes a real issue here. And now when we're measuring the consistency ratings, we're measuring them against only other tight ends, not against everyone in the team. Otherwise, most tight ends would be just sunk to the bottom. But these guys score poorly against other tight ends, and that's a real issue. So let's talk about the team first. The first team is the Rams. And everyone's pretty high on Tyler Higbee this year. And he finished, again, very strong, like Mostert. Very strong finish to the season. He got like 10-plus targets in the final 4 games after Gerald Everett got hurt. But before that, it's not like he wasn't playing on the team. He played basically every game last year. He was out for a couple of games. But for weeks 1 through 11, he was only getting anywhere from 3 to 7 targets, and it was usually on the lower end of that scale. So he ends up with a consistency rating of 1 out of 10. And, he hit that hot streak after Gerald Everett went out with the injury. But now, look, Gerald Everett is healthy. Gerald Everett was the primary tight end who got most of the volume in the first 12 weeks of the season. And Kyle Shanahan has been quoted as saying that he has got to do a better job of utilizing Gerald Everett's skill set. So that, to me, reads that he's going to be using both these guys. And we're not talking a ton of volume here. We're talking last year between these two, it was 141 targets. And so I'm seeing a split here where it's maybe going to be 80 to one and 60 to the other. And 80 is like kind of borderline tight end, startable tight end. 60 is not. But, again, it's just going to be like neither one's going to be good for your fantasy team. Now, the one thing to mention here is if I wanted to take a flyer on Gerald Everett, I would do it. If I'm in a league where I have 8 bench slots, all right, I would definitely utilize my last pick to take to just take a chance on Gerald Everett, because I think there's something that he could do there that would provide you with some positive value and perhaps startable value during the course of the season, because his ADP is at 216 right now. So he's essentially undrafted. And whereas Tyler Higbee's going at ADP number 76. So Higbee's going super early. So again, be very cautious with this team. I'm not sure I trust that there will be enough volume going to either one of these guys to make them a startable fantasy asset. So that's just my warning on that one. Now, my other one that scored very poorly on the consistency rating is Jared Cook. And Jared Cook is also very hot right now. He's going like right after Tyler Higbee. He's going at ADP number 93. He's like the next tight end that's coming off the board after Higbee. And, the big reason why he's going so early is because of his touchdowns last year. He got 9 touchdowns, which was amazing, especially when you consider he only had 46 catches. 46 catches, 9 touchdowns. To me, that is screaming at me, touchdown-dependent tight end. And there was another tight end just a couple seasons ago, a big name, Jimmy Graham, when he was in Seattle, and he had a season like this, all right? It was a 10-touchdown season, but it was under 50 catches, and you could just see that this was not someone that you wanted on your team. Yes, he had a great season. I actually had him on one of my teams that year, and I got to tell you, man, 10 touchdowns covers up a lot of warts. It makes him look way better than he is, and that's how I feel it is with Jared Cook. And going back to Jimmy Graham, Drew Brees has not been able to properly utilize a tight end since Jimmy Graham left, and just underutilizes them, undertargets them, and I'm not seeing a way that he's going to get more targets coming into next year, coming into this next season. So again, I don't trust it. I think the consistency is poor, and the only way I would play Jared Cook, again, is daily fantasy, man. That's the only way you can trust him. that you want players like this to go off. And that's something that's kind of funny, right? Even though season-long fantasy and daily fantasy utilize basically the same rules, the same scoring system, if you play your daily fantasy like you play your season-long fantasy, you'll do okay, which is what I had done through most of my time playing daily fantasy. But if you want to win daily fantasy, these are actually the kind of players that you want. Like I could just re-record this as the best the best players for daily fantasy, because these inconsistent players, that's what you want. You want you want to pick guys that are either going to get you 2 targets or 20 targets and hope that you pick them on the week that they get the 20, because that's how you're going to win in daily fantasy. So anyway, that's a little sidestep there. But so those are my list. That's my list. These guys all rated very poorly on consistency rating, and because of that, in my app they are downgraded. When you look at how I score my teams on the Vork score, consistency is one of those pieces. It makes up 20% of their Vork score. And when you get somebody that has a poor Vork score, like Amari Cooper or Mike Evans, what happens is on my app, when you're in draft mode, going round by round, picking your players, you're going to see these players are going to get pulled down the draft board. And that's great for helping you when you're trying to make these game day decisions, when you're trying to make these draft day decisions on what are the best players to take. You're going to find risky players like this pushed farther down the board than you would normally see them. And instead, you're going to see players that scored better on consistency, that have better outlooks, that offer better value, because those players will be pushed to the top of the list on each round. So this is my plug. Go to my website, go to fantasyfootballmaverick.com, sign up, and you can check out my app, My Perfect Fantasy Draft. You can sign up for free and get free access to a limited version of the app. And you can see all the consistency ratings. Like, right, you want to find out who are the most consistent players? Well, this is what you need to do. Go to my website, go to my app, and you can see who are the players that scored 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 on consistency. Those are the best players to have for fantasy this coming season. The ones you can count on every week, that they're going to do great every week for you. You know, even if they have a bad game, they still got 20 touches. And you know that next week they're going to get 20 touches again. They're going to be fine, right? That's the most important thing about consistency is you trust the player, that you can slot them in and you don't have to worry about it. They're going to get the volume. So anyway, thank you very much for watching. Well, I hope this was very informative to you. And, again, go to my website, fantasyfootballmaverick.com. Check out my app. And if you like it, you can subscribe. It's only $9.95 this month. It's for a full year of access. You can use it on as many fantasy drafts as you're in. And I'm telling you, it's going to make a difference on game day. You are going to draft so much better when you have this tool up on your phone or your tablet while you're in a live draft. It's going to make all the difference. And if you doubt me, just look at some of my mock drafts. I've already done a couple mock drafts this season. I'm going to do more, of course. But anyway, I wanted to talk about this, to talk about the consistency, and just tell you, man, mostly stay away from these players. Of this whole group, the only one I like is David Johnson, and only if I can get him in the 4th round. So that's where we're at. All right. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Stay tuned next time. We're probably going to do a mock draft next. So anyway, have yourself a good rest of your week. Enjoy your summertime, and have a great day, everybody.